Esse é o podcast Inteligência Jurídica, o espaço do Machado Meyer pensado para dividir com você a nossa visão sobre questões que impactam seus negócios e transformam realidades.
Olá, sejam bem-vindos a mais um episódio da nossa série Transição Energética aqui no podcast Inteligência Jurídica, and I'll switch to English now. First, welcome my partner back. Hi, Ana Karina.
Hello, Daniel. Hello, everyone. Very nice to be here again.
That's great. And now we're welcoming V.V Rao. Hi, V.V.
Hi, Daniel. Hi, Anna. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. V.V Rao is an LNG consultant. He has more than 25 years of experience in managing positions. A lot of his time spent with Toshiba Group. He's now an advisory role. And I think one of the great features of having V.V here is that he covers LNG from a global perspective in real life, but also he's been engaged with Brazil for some time now, so we can benefit from his view of Brazil as well. V.V, as you know, our podcast is all about energy transition. So before we dive into LNG, I think we should start there. And, we know that gas has been coined as the transition fuel. We know that from the carbon-based sources, it has the smallest carbon footprint. When it's LNG, it can move easily and replace other sources in the whole energy transition movement. But of course, nowadays, if you're talking about energy transition and LNG, it's impossible not to mention the issue of security of supply and the war in Ukraine, which, for me seemed like a defining moment for LNG. Sort of two questions in one. What is your view of the role of LNG in the energy transition? And also if you could cover what to expect as midterm outcomes of the war for the LNG markets and for ongoing projects.
Thank you for that question, Daniel. I think it's a very pertinent question given what's been happening. The first thing that I'd say is that I think LNG is going to play a fairly significant role in the energy transition. It was already starting to play a fairly significant role, and in my view, probably a bridging role, especially in the 2030s. That was the case anyways, but I think the Ukrainian invasion in February of 2022, of course, has had a significant impact on that because it's also brought in the issue of energy security. And I think as part of this, what that event did was that it all of a sudden made people realize that gas, like oil, is now a geopolitical commodity. People always knew that if there was some kind of a disturbance on the Straits of Hormuz, it would impact the price of oil. And now I think we're seeing in even more stark terms what happened in 2022 as a result of the Ukrainian invasion. You had significant price jumps. So one thing I'd say is it's become a geopolitical commodity, which is very significant. The second thing I think that's happened in terms of energy transition is that Europe is now becoming a baseload market for LNG. Historically, if you looked at the liquefied natural gas industry, it started as an industry where gas was going from Southeast Asia or sometimes the Middle East to Northeast Asia. So they were essentially going from dedicated gas reserves to a dedicated trade to Northeast Asia. And Northeast Asia didn't have sufficient fuels of their own. So it was a bilateral trade. And essentially, whoever else bought LNG was buying a little bit of it for seasonal flexibility, winter times, for example, or suppliers were selling it to other parts of the world because they needed to get rid of excess supply. With Europe now emerging as a baseload customer, by baseload, what I mean is they're using it every month, on a fairly even basis throughout the year. So what you're going to see, I think, by the end of the 2020s is that Europe will be consuming about 25% of the global supply. Asia will still be consuming about over 50%, Northeast Asia. But I think what this does, though, is that LNG is now being considered a solution to two issues. One is it's providing a energy transition solution, I think, in the late 20s and early 30s as a lower carbon emitting fuel. But I think the second thing is it's also filling an energy security that a lot of countries are facing. Okay, that's primarily true in Europe, but it's also true in other parts of the world, like China, for example. China's actually got a lot of gas in the west side of the country, but they haven't been able to exploit it fully and get it over to the east side of the country. So I think this is a very interesting thing, and it's going to be interesting to see how LNG unfolds. But I think it's going to have a dynamic future, one in which the U.S. LNG exports probably becomes massive. The U.S. will likely become the largest exporter of LNG in the world by quite a distance by 2030.
Thank you, V.V. And now going further, and maybe from the perspective of the offer of LNG in the arena, there's an interesting article by Rystad commenting that while the amount to be invested in 2024 for LNG is much higher than 21 and 22, it is expected that FIDs will probably from then on decrease as part of the effects of the energy transition, right? In that sense, what is your view in terms of the offer of LNG in the international market? Is this a likely scenario? Is it too soon to call, given yet the uncertain aspects of the current energy crisis?
I think there's two or three components to that question. So let me take the first one. There's definitely been a significant expansion of LNG development in the world. And the numbers that Rystad are putting up are correct, and they're very compelling. There's going to be a wave of construction of, in an LNG terms, it's about 184 million tons per year. Okay. And for those of you that work in millions of cubic meters a day, that's about 750 million cubic meters per day. Okay. So it's a significant amount of LNG development that's either in construction or in late development. So they're going to issue an FID fairly soon. So I think everybody agrees with that. A lot of that was in construction anyway. The issue then is what happens post 2025 or 26? Okay. There's different schools of thought on this. I think the predominant school of thought, which I agree with, is that there's going to be another wave of LNG construction. It may not be as big as the one that we're seeing right now, but it may be in the order of 130 to 150 million tons. So that may be something like 600 million cubic meters per day of LNG that's going to happen. And the reason I think it's going to happen is because Europe is becoming a baseload market for LNG. That's one reason. The second is getting back to the energy transition point that we were just talking about. The ambitions that a lot of countries had, I think, about going green by 2030, in a lot of countries, that's fairly difficult to achieve in practical terms. So they're having to rely on LNG as a bit of a bridge fuel. So I think this is going to spur on more projects. Okay. The next question I think about the offer is, where is the offer going to come from? If you are building another, between what we just talked about, what's being developed now and what will be developed in the future, that's about 330 million tons or over 1 billion cubic meters of gas per day. My guess is that about over 50 to 60% of that will come from the United States. And some of it will come from Qatar. Some of it will also come from the rest of the world. Maybe, so if you say 60% from the US, there might be another 15% from Qatar, and the rest of it will come from other places like Africa, Mozambique, Australia, Papua New Guinea, places like that. There's two more interesting things about the offer, I think, is that one is, what's the price? Does the price of the offer change? And I think the offer price goes up a little bit. It's up a little bit now from what it was before. Prices before were around 10 to 11% of Brent. I think it's going to go up to more like 12 to 13% for the next couple of years, but it should come back down because there's going to be a lot of competition. So in other words, a lot more LNG. I think you can argue about whether it's, 40% or whether it's 60%. But I think there is an envelope of what that development looks like.
And V.V, now flipping to the demand side, right, and still on the international arena, and now relying on a study by McKinsey, right? They claim that the LNG demand grows at 3.6% per annum until 2035. We see oversupply returning to the market by 24-26, with new capacity required from 28 onwards. However, as you commented, right, we see giants like Shell and Total announcing investments of LNG projects in Qatar, right? And we also have the European crisis, where a ban on Russian gas will likely mean a big demand for LNG. So what is your view on the demand outlook internationally for LNG?
So personally, I think McKinsey's number is a bit conservative. Okay, at 3.5%. Personally, I think that number is somewhere above 5%. There's some estimates that I've seen actually up at 7%. I think that may be a bit too high. And I'll tell you why I think it's conservative. Okay, it's a couple of interesting reasons for that. One is that, like I said, gas is becoming a geopolitical commodity. There's different reasons why gas may not be available. Okay, so because of the liquidity, the physical liquidity of LNG in the world, you can actually get LNG fairly quickly. Even if you're a new market, you could put up an FSRU terminal within 2.5 years. Okay, a floating ship. So LNG is often being used to fill emergency gaps. Like if you look at Germany right now, they've, in 2022, Germany had several problems with Russian gas. They decided to put up several LNG terminals, in fact, 4 or 5 of them in a matter of 12 months. Okay. So I think forecasts don't build into account disruptive events. And what you'll find, I think, if you look back over the LNG industry, is there's always disruptive events. There was a tsunami in 2011 that changed the LNG market. Okay. There was a pandemic which reduced market, and then there was a war that increased market. So there's always something going on that seems to change it. But if you look historically, I think more like a 4 to 5% number is realistic. The demand for LNG in 2022 is about 380 million tons. People are forecasting that LNG demand by 2030 is probably going to be somewhere around 620 to 630 million tons, which corresponds to a slightly above 5% growth rate. I think that's why Shell and Total, BP, and a lot of companies are actually putting money into infrastructure because they know that there's this what I'll call in American terms a wild card. There's always something that seems to happen that you could never expect. And the issue is, am I comfortable with having surplus capacity in my books? And even if you have surplus capacity in LNG terms, it's probably okay because once in a while LNG prices spike. So you can make in 1 year what it may have taken 5 years to make historically. So they're comfortable with a long position. And I think that's what that's reflective of, those dynamics.
It's a very interesting perspective. We tend to focus on what's going on right now, but as you said, the reality is that I said a defining moment in the beginning, but maybe there has been others. At such time, people also thought they were defining moments. Now, V.V, we're getting towards the end, but of course, we left one of the most interesting pieces, which is Brazil, right? How do we fit in all of this? You know that our matrix, our energy matrix, has a particular role for LNG. In particular, it is a source for thermal power generation, which in its turn, very important for energy security and balancing the fact that we have a lot of renewable sources which are intermittent, but our availability and capacity for terminals and to import is very limited, at least on a global perspective. So again, taking the advantage of a twofold question, how do you see this new moment, at least in terms of price and the fight to get the commodity, how it affects Brazil? And the second, do you see a scenario where Brazil becomes a more relevant player in this chessboard, or are we still, when we see long-term, seeing Brazil as a very limited player, at least for the LNG perspective?
So let me give just a bit of context before I address the two questions. One thing is, if you look at global LNG markets, they've generally been broken down into 3 or 4 types of markets. Okay. The one is you're using LNG as a baseload fuel for core industries like power, in some cases gas heating. And that's what Northeast Asia has done. Okay. And it's their primary fuel. In other words, they're limited in indigenous gas supply or energy supply in general. Another kind of market, and so that's Japan, that's Korea, that's Taiwan. Okay. There's other markets where they have some indigenous gas and they have access to pipeline gas, but they're using LNG as an important supplement to their gas. Okay. That's Europe. Okay. And then you have that's also Singapore to some extent. Singapore has some import pipelines from Malaysia and Indonesia, but they're using it to supplement in a very meaningful way. Brazil is actually very different. Brazil's primary energy source is hydro. Okay. And increasingly going into renewables. So with Brazil, what I view LNG is a bit of a backup fuel to the hydro system. So even if you look at the way the capacity reserve auctions are structured, they want capacity. But if there's wet years every year for the next 15 years, the idea is that LNG wouldn't be dispatched at all, right? Because as a matter of policy, Brazil wants to use water first. Okay. To answer one of your questions, Daniel, how does Brazil fit in the market? Well, Brazil wants to be a limited importer of LNG, basically only when it needs to. Okay. Now, there are a few other situations recently in Brazil where they're using it more for gas markets. There's one terminal in particular that's using it for a gas market, but that's kind of a limited scenario. Most of the time, it's a backup fuel for the power sector. So because of that, I think to your second question, where does it fit into the LNG landscape? Well, last year was a very big year for LNG imports. 2021 was a very big year for LNG imports, about 7 million tons. And that amounted to 2% of the LNG market. So in a big year, 2021, Brazil was 2%. There's no question that American suppliers and West African suppliers like Angola, Nigeria, the US would like to export LNG into Brazil. The question is, does Brazil need it or want it? And my own view is that I think Brazil wants it to a limited extent and ideally wouldn't want it much beyond 2040. Because I think at some point people do see that associated gas, a pre-salt associated gas, is going to make its way into the Brazil market. And there's so much of it that logically you should not need LNG for, let's say, the next 25 years. I mean, I don't see that in 2045. But if someone said, is Brazil still importing 6 or 7 million tons in 2030 or 2035? I'd say sure. I think that's a definite possibility.
The associated gas coming to the market would be definitely a change game-changing factor for Brazil. That's
yeah.
clear. Thank you, V.V.
Sure. But it's interesting to hear, V.V, this expression that you used, the wild card. So that's indeed, right, a very special feature of the LNG business, right? It's present whenever, or most importantly, when we have an energy crisis or when we have any external events that are not expected, right? And then the LNG can go the energy demand, right?
Yeah. Anna, I think what's so interesting about LNG is you wouldn't have made that comment about LNG 15 years ago. But now there's so many exporting countries for LNG. There's over 20 exporting countries, and there's over 44 countries that import LNG. So you can get LNG basically from every continent now. That makes it different. So there's sea lanes. It's become much more like crude oil in the sense that you can depend on it. There's a lot more ships. So it's like the analogy that I sometimes use is if you were the first person that bought a fax machine, you had no one to fax to. Okay, but if you buy a fax machine now, you can send a fax to 1 billion people. Okay, now LNG is not at 1 billion people, but it's no longer one fax machine. There's several hundred fax machines in the LNG trade. It's a lot more dependable as an alternate fuel.
So thank you. Now we are heading for the end of our conversation. It's a pity. I would like to stay here much more. so interesting, and we learned so much from you. So our final question to you, we always end our podcasts with a question on or an insight on diversity and inclusion in the energy segment. So I was just wondering whether you would like to share with us, any insights or any comments or any interesting experiences that you witnessed, or any other comment generally that you believe might be worth sharing.
It's interesting. Your listeners probably don't know this, but I'm a Canadian and I grew up in Calgary, and I was trained as an electrical engineer, and I spent the first 15 years of my life working for a power company as a substation designer. So it was a very technical kind of role, and really I just worked within the Calgary area, within the province of Alberta. I didn't really know many people, professionally outside of my trade locally. And then I joined the LNG industry in 1997 with Enron. And what I found even then in an earlier stage was how international the trade actually was. And so within 2 years of being in this LNG business, I was all of a sudden having conversations with people in Singapore, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Brunei, in Oman, in Abu Dhabi, in Australia. And the interesting thing was you'd go to these conferences and you'd have, Europeans and Africans and everybody talking. It was some of these LNG conventions were like the UN. I was just kind of shocked. And now if you go to LNG conferences in the current state, they're attended by 3,000 people from different countries. You'll have a Nigerian doing a deal with a fellow from Thailand, and in that same meeting, someone from the US will come and say, hey, how are you? And it's, you want to talk about diversity and inclusion. I think that is the LNG industry, because by definition, we're an industry that involves cross-border trade. You're almost always going from one country, which is in one location, and you're going to another country. You're sending LNG to another country. And those are two different cultures. So, I think that for me, my life has definitely been enriched by having exposure to so many cultures from a personal standpoint, but also different business cultures. Everybody negotiates differently. They start in different ways. Some people are like, let's not worry about the term sheet. Let's just go straight to the heads of agreement. Other people are meticulous about starting and doing a process. And so you find that there's different ways of negotiating and different ways of interacting with people. And at the end of the day, the one thing I do notice is that most people in this industry love being in the industry. And so they're like me. They're from different places like power. They get into the industry and they never leave it. They just somehow hang around in this place for years and years. And I think diversity and inclusion is a big part of the reason why. It's fun.
It's so nice. I think the diversity there, you mentioned Enron in the 90s, was there in this sense that you mentioned, right? It was people from all over the world with the same sort of objectives and making the business grow and making the deals happen. And you're right. You get to know how people see the same sort of deal process in such a different way. I'm sure you've had many deals over caipirinhas here in Brazil, and that's something we missed quite a lot during the pandemic. Thank you so much again, V, for sharing. You're obviously a person that beyond your capabilities and knowledge about the industry, I think you always contribute because you really have an eye on the global arena and another great eye for Brazil. And so that makes you someone who can see the whole thing. And I'm sure the audience has appreciated. So thank you so much for joining us in today's episode.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you, Anna.
Este foi mais um episódio. Fique ligado que em 15 dias teremos outro. Um abraço e até o próximo.
Até o próximo.
Você ouviu o podcast Inteligência Jurídica, o espaço de encontro para dividirmos com você a nossa visão sobre as questões que impactam os seus negócios.